welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jen, a library aide in media, and I am here with my fabulous co-host.
Hey, this is Jessica. Welcome back, everybody, to the official podcast of Syosset Library, not the unofficial one. We have to make that happen one day.
Like, we should have an unauthorized.
We need to wear goatees and stuff and pretend we're evil.
And anyway, evil or not, we are here with a supremely talented writer whose work we both admire so highly. Could we ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hey, my name is Annalee Newitz. I'm a science journalist who also writes science fiction, and my latest book is a science fiction novel called The Terraformers. So The Terraformers is a multi-generational epic set 60,000 years in the future. So lots of stuff has happened. We have lots of new technologies, and it's about 3 generations of workers who are helping to create an Earth-like planet for a somewhat sketchy interstellar real estate development company. And over the course of the book, which takes about, a few thousand years because future and terraforming takes a really long time, our group of characters start to realize just how shady this company is and what they can do to fight back. And for me, the most fun part of this book, other than doing research on how to build a planet, was putting together the characters. Some of them are humans that you might recognize. Some of them are robots. Some of them are animals with human equivalent intelligence. So there's a flying moose, who's one of my favorite characters. There's a cyborg cow. Of course, there's naked mole rats working in the labs. And one of the main characters is a sentient flying train, because I love public transit and I wanted to imagine what it would be like to chat with the trains that I ride on every day. So it's the story of these people and their struggle to claim the land that they've helped to create.
So I've read all 3 of your novels and I love them all extremely, extremely deeply. And one of the things, you're welcome. One of the things that impresses me the most about them is that these books are also different in, the world building and their concerns and the structure. But despite the diversity in the stories, you deal with a lot of the same themes and ideas and questions about technology and identity. And I'm just wondering, how do these interests that you've developed, how do they allow you to go to so many different places in your stories, if that makes sense?
It's really true. I actually noticed that all of my novels start with people killing a crappy guy. And I was like, okay, my next novel can definitely not start with killing a crappy guy, because this is getting to be kind of a weird theme. But I think the reason they start that way is because all of my stories are about power struggles, and they're about who is allowed to count as an important person, who's allowed to determine their own destiny in each of these worlds. And so I think that they often start with this kind of violent conflict because, in fact, as we know from being humans on Earth, a lot of these kinds of power struggles do become violent. And a lot of my characters have been exposed to that violence and want to stop it, or want to find a community of people that accepts them and values them and isn't a violent community. And so I think these are pretty big transcendent themes. They kind of cross history and they cross a lot of different worlds. And so that's why in my work, you'll visit a lot of different worlds, but you're never going to forget that certain people are in charge and they're trying to protect what they have. And that means disenfranchising the majority of characters in the story.
Definitely. It's so funny. It was almost like a tour of your other novels when you were just saying that before. I was like, yeah, definitely. I mean, one really quick question I have is that Terraformers has been it's kind of like three interconnected novellas. Um, did it start as smaller stories and then you wove them together, or did you always think that conceive of the story to go in that direction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I always wanted it to secretly be three interconnected novellas. Again, I love intergenerational stories, and I love interconnected novellas that kind of take us to a new place, but don't require, but they take us to a new place and then build on themes from the previous story. So I'm a huge fan of like Murderbot, and I feel like those books do a really good job of exploring new places, but taking our same characters along with us. And so when I think the one thing that changed a lot is that when I first conceived of the book, I was like, okay, it's going to be 3 equal parts. And when I pitched the book, I already knew what the main characters would be in each section. I thought I knew. And as I wrote, what ended up happening was the first section about Destry, who is a Homo sapiens living on this planet. And she's there before the planet is really inhabited by anyone other than the workers who are developing the planet. So it's a completely undeveloped, natural, quote unquote, natural ecosystem. I mean, it can't be too natural because they built it from scratch. They've deliberately put all that stuff there. But her story wound up being a lot longer than I thought it would be. So her story takes up I think it's almost half the book. And that makes sense because a lot of the events that she witnesses and a lot of the decisions that she makes are incredibly important to later parts of the book. And her legacy continues to be in people's minds even after she's dead, which she's dead by the second and third parts of the book. And so I guess if I'd had another year or 2 years, I might have made the third section of the book a bit longer so we could have had more time with the train. It's still it's a hefty book. It's the longest book I've ever written. But it's not a doorstopper. Like I kept telling my editor, it's going to be an epic. And she's like, oh, okay, like 200,000 words. And I'm like, no, like 110,000 words. Like, so to me, that's a long book, but I realized that for other people, that's kind of a normal length.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the structure. And, one of the questions that I had with regards to that was, you achieve like a very delicate balance with it because like we're looking at these like epic processes that take place over such large time scales, but they're still very like real emotional states because you're still talking about like individuals who have finite, if like, extended lives. And I was wondering like, how did you imagine like how people would like change and relate to each other and grow and evolve over such long periods, because like so much of how we interact with the world and other people has to do with like, how we're here for a short time and, we want to do things while we're here. So like, how did you envision that for such a different sort of like time scale?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And I hadn't quite thought about it before because you're right. I mean, these are characters who can conceivably live for 1,000 years or even longer. Some of the characters who are very wealthy, who have access to a lot of resources, live for like 5,000 years. And in fact, there's one character who's kind of a bad guy who is alive throughout the entire course of the book. And we see her change and kind of evolve a little bit. And I think what I was thinking about a lot with these characters is that they have jobs that are they're dealing with geological processes and ecological processes. So when we think of our lives, we think, okay, I have a job, where I go in the morning and I come home in the evening and I have projects that might take a year or a week, or maybe a book project that takes 5 years or something. But for someone like Destry, who's the main character in the first section, her job takes about 1,000 years. Like in order to grow a forest, a rich, well-stocked forest that has good soil and all of the other stuff they need, that, kind of requires that kind of attention span, that you need to be around for hundreds of years. So I feel like her experience kind of expands to fill that project. And so she doesn't necessarily think of it as, she's not like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with my time? She's like, well, first I have to grow the trees. That's going to take a few hundred years. Then I have to make sure that the ecosystem is in balance. And she deals with a lot of ecosystem emergencies. There's like volcanoes. There's a horrific ecosystem emergency that she talks about in a flashback where she's dealing with a bunch of crocodilians that just keep fighting with each other and eating each other, and they can't figure out why all the crocodiles are eating all the mammals, and and that's actually based on a real ecosystem in the early Triassic period, where it's a super unstable ecosystem where there were a bunch of crocodilians that were eating each other and competing with each other, and they kept going extinct, and like the ecosystem kept collapsing. And anyway, that's one of my favorite ecosystem stories. So I threw it in. So one of the things that is happening, though, to answer your question about their emotional lives, is that we do see characters having multiple relationships over their lives that are very important to them. There's, Destry has an old friend and lover who is kind of in her past, but kind of in her present. She develops new, really deep relationships that last for centuries. And so it gives her a very strong sense of family with her colleagues in the environmental rescue team, which is the group that's developing the ecosystem. And so we see her family is quite expansive, and it includes like a moose. Whistle, her best friend and mount, is a moose, and Whistle has a whole romantic arc and like a drama that she's involved in, and she's kind of his best friend, but she's kind of his mom, and like it's really complicated. Like having that kind of a long-term relationship means having to transition from being kind of a parent figure to being kind of a sibling figure or like a friend figure. And so we get to kind of see how people navigate that, and that's something that a lot of humans kind of do, but it is harder because we're such a short time that we're here, and we don't get to have the pleasure of watching a whole ecosystem evolve like Destry does. So there's definitely some wish fulfillment in there for me. Like, I wish I could see the outcome of this ecosystem collapse. Hopefully, a future generation will watch the ecosystems rise again on Earth.
Yeah, I hope so.
Do you consider this speculative fiction in a way? Because I know you do, your stuff when it comes to this, and you just dazzled us with that fun story about your favorite ecosystem collapse. Do you consider this speculative fiction?
Oh, absolutely. This is speculative fiction for sure. This is in some ways, this is very old school science fiction. It's about an outer space colony. It's set on the planet. We don't actually go into space very often in the story, but it's an interplanetary, interstellar civilization connected by wormholes. They have technologies that are unimaginable to us, right? Like I definitely sketched out a kind of timeline between now and this future, but not every single invention that we see on this planet, we don't know if it's possible. Like, are we going to have all of the characters in this book are genetically engineered? And like I said, there's non-human animals like moose and cows that are basically human. They're not human, they're people, right? They're human equivalent people. And will that ever happen? I don't know. Like, it's vaguely based on science that we have now, but it's the pleasure of setting a book 60,000 years in the future is I can say, like, sure, why not? That could happen. We could develop an interstellar civilization. It's one possibility. And, another possibility is very, very different. So I like to have, I guess, what you could call very grounded speculative fiction. So a lot of the things in the book are very hand wavy. For example, Whistle the moose can fly. Many of the characters can fly. Well, why is that? Well, I like the idea of being able to fly. So I came up with a hand wavy notion that there's something called gravity mesh that you can apparently implant into people's bodies and it makes them fly. I have some ideas about how that might feel. I have no idea how that would work. It doesn't make sense if you're a physicist. There'd be a lot of energy released. It could, there's a lot of sort of assumptions about like how we now can kind of control things at a molecular level that we absolutely can't now, at an atomic level, I should say. So there's that kind of goofy stuff. And then there's also very realistic ecosystems in the book. And I did a lot of research on the geology of the planet. I talked to geologists. I talked to a couple of experts on plate tectonics, which is a big part of the story about how volcanoes function on the planet. There are ecosystems in this book that are very strongly based on ecosystems from Brazil, from Canada, and a few other places that I've thrown in. And as I'm writing, I would have like many windows open in my browser to like scientific papers or educational materials that were like, if you had a boreal forest, this is what the soil would be like. If you had a tropical savanna, this is the kind of plant life you would expect to see. Because my characters are environmental scientists, so they would be thinking about those things too. So there's a mixture of what I would call kind of highly speculative science with very grounded, realistic science. So that's I think a standard science fiction thing to do.
I am particularly interested in how you imagine the relationships between the human and less human sentient creatures, because it's very lived in and very messy and complicated, like to the extent that like even the people in the relationships are like, what is the hierarchy here, and like should there be a hierarchy, and like what do we do about it, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just wondering like what sort of what went into imagining like the consciousnesses of such a wide diversity of human life.
Yeah, that again was a big pleasure in writing this book. Was I knew that there would be a lot of people who were not humans, and a lot of even some of the characters who are kind of humanoid are not Homo sapiens. They're called Homo alteris, which is kind of a knockoff brand of Homo sapiens. And even again, the Homo sapiens like have all kinds of weird modifications. So I love thinking about humans' relationships with non-human intelligence. And I think now, especially in the last like 10 years, scientists are starting to more openly talk about the idea that non-human animals have intelligence that maybe we just don't understand yet, or that we're just beginning to appreciate. Corvids like crows and ravens are incredible puzzle solvers. It really seems like octopuses are probably maybe as smart as we are, or maybe they're smart in a different way, but like maybe as smart. We're starting to realize that intelligence itself is extremely flexible. One of the things that I think is so inspiring about movements around neurodiversity is acknowledging that even among humans, we have many ways of thinking about the world and many kinds of intelligence. We don't all, things like IQ tests are just such crap because they only measure this one type of thinking. And there's so many ways to think about the world brilliantly and in a helpful way that have nothing to do with being able to get a really high score on an IQ test. So I approach it I try to think about non-human creatures like, say, a moose, like Whistle, who's a major character. I spent a lot of time reading, there's a scientific journal about moose behavior called Alsace. And so I read a lot about like moose emotional expressions and like how do moose express happiness. As far as we know, I mean, moose are not very widely studied, unfortunately. It's mostly sort of like wildlife ecologists and land management experts who are studying them. But one thing I learned is that they love water and they love to play in the water, and they like to kick up their back feet when they're playing in the water. And so I thought a lot about like like how would Whistle express happiness? Like he's not going to smile, but he kicks up his heels. And I read for my cow character Zest. I read about cow facial expressions because a lot of farmers and ranchers think about like what does a cow look like if it's in pain. And actually, we know pretty well like when cows are in pain or upset, they kind of their faces look kind of skeletal because they're clenching their teeth and their muscles are really tense. So their faces kind of look like they're wan, you know, like they're kind of withdrawn, and the skin kind of retracts into their skull. And so I was like, all right, like now I have a sense of what a cow would look like when she's upset. And indeed, the character gets really pissed off at one point, and I talk about how her skin is kind of tight against her skull at that point. So I think about that stuff. And then also in the book, one of the ways that the bioengineers who've built all of these people have tried to create a false hierarchy is that they've actually built certain people to have a full and complete vocabulary. They have neurotypical brains and they are able to express themselves as they like. But then there are other classes of people called mounts, like Whistle, the moose who Destry rides. And they also have full intelligence, but their brains have been damaged so that they can only speak in monosyllables. So that was actually one of the things I was very careful about when Whistle speaks, or Whistle doesn't speak, Whistle texts, because Whistle doesn't have a human mouth. But when Whistle texts, Whistle can only use words with one syllable unless he's using like a proper name. And so it makes him sound like he is a fool oftentimes. It makes him sound like he's less intelligent. And I thought that was a very plausible way that a screwed up hierarchical society would try to create creatures that they thought of as being lesser than, was they would say like, oh, well, we're going to measure intelligence with language. Certain animals just can't speak. And there's another class of creatures called blessed, and blesseds can only talk about the work that they do. So they can only say something if it is related to, like, say they're a cook. They can only say things related to cooking or food. And so it allows the people who are at the top of the hierarchy to feel very smart indeed, because of course they can say whatever they like. And everyone else is forced to like express themselves in these really limited ways. So that was a way that has nothing to do with really thinking about real life non-human animals on Earth, and more thinking about how humans imagine intelligence and how false it is and how constructed it is. And I often do think, I mean, I'm one of those people who does believe that many non-human animals are human equivalent in intelligence. Like, I'm sure that dolphins and whales and elephants and corvids and like, all kinds of animals they're just like us, but they don't communicate in the same way. But because they don't communicate like us, humans are like, oh, well, they must just be dumber. They must have, faulty minds. And it's really just because we haven't freaking bothered to try to translate what they're saying. And I often think, like, what if we just put a lot of effort into trying to translate what dolphins are saying instead of pretending like, oh, they're just making sounds. Funny how they have unique sounds for each other, almost like a name, but that couldn't be a name. It's just a unique sound. And I'm like, dude, it's a name. Like, come on. Anyway, I get very pissed off about that kind of stuff.
It's funny because you kind of just already sort of went into something I was going to talk about, like the theme of dominance over animals, and just a really quick comment, and then I'll give it back over to Jen. I like, in a way, just this was a more nuanced version, or I don't want to say version because it's not, but it was like almost it's almost like a more nuanced look at say like Brave New World, where it's like, okay, we're
Yes.
all born in factories, and this bottle is this, and you have this in it, and you're this class and you're this class. This was just it's just more nuanced than that. I was that actually part, were you thinking that at all while you were
But
putting this together?
I must have been. I mean, I read Brave New World when I was pretty young, and then reread it later as an adult. And I find that story really compelling. I wasn't conscious of it, but I'm sure it was in the back of my mind. I think what was more at the front of my mind were books like Watership Down, which I read as a kid, and I mean, I think all of us had our hearts ripped out by it. And like the comic book by Grant Morrison called We Three, which is about a military project to uplift a cute bunny and a cute kitty and a doggy. Oh my God. I actually read that comic book while I was at the gym working out, which was incredibly silly to do. And I was like weeping as I was on the Stairmaster. It was not good. And I was also like later in the book, I was really influenced by the TV show Tuca and Birdie, which is also about a world of non-human people. And it's a very different kind of story, but it's a world of many types of animals having intelligence. And all of those things were kind of smushed up together in my mind. Plus with just the fact that like, I think many people have had a fantasy of being friends with a moose because they're so cute, and their noses, apparently, I recently read an article that said that they have the softest noses in the animal kingdom. I was like, I want to touch the softest nose in the animal kingdom.
I'm so glad that that's a statistic that somebody is measuring and maintaining. Like that's
I'm sure that it's not entirely accurate. I mean, I don't even know how do you measure softness. Like, I don't know what the smallest unit of soft nose is, but like they do look very soft though.
Me too. Okay. Oh yeah. So speaking of your different like cultural touchstones and literary allusions, my brain was kind of sparked by one of the so each chapter has an excerpt from the guide that the rangers, all these characters, use in order to terraform. And one of them that really stuck with me was, don't build a person if you don't intend to be their ally. And I was like, is that like sort of a direct rebuke to like Victor Frankenstein, you know?
Oh, yeah, actually. I mean, I hadn't thought of it, but yes. I mean, I feel like to me that was a rebuke to things like people like Frankenstein, scientists who are trying to, build new life forms, even today, but also parents, like if you're building a child, like that's your ally. Don't build a child if you're going to abuse them. Like that's just like hard no. And I feel like a lot of, and I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but I do think that in our civilization, a lot of our animal abuse and our child abuse come from kind of the same broken place in human culture. And I just feel very strongly that that's how we should approach life, is like, if you bring a life into the world, however you do it, if it's in the lab or from your own body, like that's your future friend, and treat them like that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, just to wrap up with a little bit of a left turn, I loved that Destry was named Destry, and I appreciated the reference so much, and it just fit the character so well. And that first scene is such a perfect sort of like very iconic like Western showdown type scene, And so I was wondering, were there like other Western texts, either books or films or characters and stuff that like kind of informed your portrayal here?
Yeah, I mean, in general, it was definitely, there are parts of this book that are homages to Westerns. And of course, there's many references to Destry Rides Again in this novel, although not as many as I'd originally thought there would be. There are a lot of characters who have names that come from the movie Destry Rides Again. And for folks who haven't seen it, the thing that's great about that movie is that it's kind of an anti-Western. It's an anti-gun Western. And the thing about Destry Jr. is that he is a crack shot, but he hates guns and he doesn't think that people should have guns. And he only uses his gun in a great emergency. Like he's not a gunslinger. He's like a protector and a defender. Your classic white hat. So the character Destry in my novel is kind of the child of that character in a way. Like her dad is a Destry and her mom is Frenchie. And in the movie, Frenchie is the woman who runs the brothel who becomes an ally of Destry when he comes to town. So I was thinking about that. I was thinking a lot about classic 30s Westerns. I've been really influenced by the aesthetics of those Westerns, the big open landscapes, the stories of Europeans colonizing the West. And this is explicitly an anti-colonizer novel, as it will be very obvious to anyone reading it. It's about people who have lived on the land for a long time, laying claim to that land and refusing to allow it to be colonized. And so there's also in the book a lot of references to the colonization of Canada by Europeans. There's a lot of cities that take their names from cities in Canada that have large Indigenous populations like Laurent, and which is, of course, one of the heroic cities in the book. And so there's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of Western but anti-Western at the same time. It's sort of like, what if the colonization of the West in the Americas were set in this really different place? So there's also a lot of things that don't match up. Like, I don't want to say it's not an allegory. It's definitely a very, very different world and a very different context. But there's echoes for sure. It's definitely inspired by decolonization movements and land back movements.
I love that, and I really love the way that this book uses genre. And I just feel like over the course of like doing this job and, interviewing so many writers and reading so many books, like it's really changed the way that I think about genre. And I sort of see it less as a place that you write from and kind of more as like a buffet that you partake of, and I was wondering, like, yeah, how do you see this project like relating to the various genres that you touch on and dip into?
In some ways, I do think it's a classic science fiction novel because it is about terraforming, classic trope in science fiction. It's set on another planet. It doesn't have aliens, but it has non-human people. It has robots as major characters. And of course, science fiction does share a lot of territory with the Western. I think that was a kind of a pun. I don't know. Anyway, so there's like a lot of overlap between the two. And so I think of it as, I just think of it as a story. It's a story. It's strongly influenced by science fiction. And I hope that people who love science fiction will like it. And I hope that people who love just storytelling about generational relationships will like it too, So, I hope that people get different stuff out of it. But I don't sit down and say, like, I'm going to have 30% this, 30% science fiction, 20% fantasy. Like, it's just, I love science. And so I automatically end up writing science fiction. And then the other stuff that creeps in is from, the culture that I'm living in, where I saw a lot of Westerns.
So are you working on another book right now?
I am. I'm finishing up my next nonfiction book, which is a history of psychological and cultural warfare in the United States. It's probably the most difficult book I've ever written. It's very depressing, obviously. And it will have a happy ending. Like the final part of the book is about how to end psychological war, how to engage in psychological disarmament. But I'm not to that section yet. So I'm still in the really depressing part. And I do have another novel that I'm working on as well. I'm under contract for another novel from Tor, and it's going to be I'm pretty sure it's going to be about an alien graduate student who is studying human culture in a brothel in ancient Rome. That's what I think right now. We'll see what happens.
Wow, that sounds amazing. A particular thing for me lately has been like novels about grad students too, because I just sort of like graduated from that experience myself, and I'm like, gosh, I have a lot of processing to do. I'm glad people are writing about it.
Yeah, me too. As someone who was a graduate student for a long time, I have many feelings that I need to. I think that's another thing in all my books. There's always graduate students or people who are like in some way connected to like scholarly institutions. So, yeah.
Oh man, this was so much fun. I really hope we can get back to you and talk to you about that because that sounds
Yeah.
amazing. Literally, like everything that I see your name on, I'm like, yes, we're reading this. And
Aw,
actually, it's funny
thank you.
because Jen, before she became a worker here, we were friends, and you were working in a bookstore, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, Jen, read Future of Another Timeline. It will change your life.
Yeah, and then pretty much like 8 days later, I was like, yeah, crying in the bathtub. I'm like, yes, my life has changed. Like,
Yeah, that book made me cry too. It's always weird when you write a scene that makes you cry. You're
yes,
like,
oh my
yeah,
gosh.
it's a thing.
Well,
Cool.
thank you so much. This was amazing. Please come back and chat with us about anything you want. Really,
Absolutely.
just like I want to talk to you about cereal. I'll be like, yeah, let's do it. Let's discuss it.
My thoughts on Bran.
Please.
Happy to share.
And
Yeah, thank you again. You guys asked such great
Fran
questions.
with Syosset Library.
Actually, that is my next sci-fi novel. It's just basically going to be about Bran, sentient Bran. You know,
Nice.
its journey through my intestines.
Love Please, do it.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And thank you, listeners, for listening. I highly recommend that you pick up the Terraformers. It's absolutely fantastic. This is Jen and my co-host
Is Jessica.
signing off with Annalee Newitz and the Terraformers. And it's time to close this chapter. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Oh,
you.
this is great. Thank you so much.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.